What makes something an instance of gaslighting, and what does it all mean? In today's episode, Abby Nicolas joins Mike and Joey for part 2 of our episode on blurred minds. We'll dive a little deeper into what the distinction is between memory distortions and gaslighting. Have you been gaslit? Let's find out.
All right, welcome to Cracking the Shell on Psychological Science. This is actually going to be part 2 of our episode on the science of memory distortions and how it intersects with gaslighting. And in this episode, we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about gaslighting specifically and some of maybe the research on gaslighting.
Yeah, and before we get into that, I did want to kind of like jump into hearing back your interaction about the did I gaslight, didn't I gaslight piece, but I really appreciated you guys mentioning the unintentional nature of the interaction, the false memory interaction, because it reminds me of like what gaslighting truly is, you know, in the abuse literature where we see the introduction of the term gaslighting. It speaks to the idea that someone is intentionally on a campaign to have someone question their reality. And you can feel gaslit, certainly, but in more interactions rather than not, we're engaging in trying to resolve a conflict, and we have memories. They might be false, they might be emotionally laden, and we're busy trying to convince the other person, like, believe in my reality, right. Not necessarily discount your own or question your own. And so I think many of the times that we hear gaslighting being used, it is in typical ordinary interactions where there isn't necessarily the intention to have someone doubt themselves as a whole, but more so in an effort to resolve conflict, and maybe perhaps not always in the most effective way, but really to be understood. Or I didn't mean it that way. I didn't do that, right? So right. I think it's really important for us to recognize that there are people who experience gaslighting and it may be genuinely more abusive, and that for the rest of us, we experience probably typical everyday interactions where we disagree on what really happened.
I think that's a great point, Abby. And I think you made a comment earlier when we were off mic about, you know, generally most people aren't psychopaths.
Yes.
Right? Do you want to expand on that?
Yes. I think this is one of the dangers with gaslighting, and also we could talk about narcissism for another day. Oh, yeah. But one of the dangers with us popularizing the term is not only does it maybe water it down and discount the experiences of individuals who are encountering interpersonal abuse or toxicity, but also it leaves people believing that individuals are more sociopathic or psychopathic and intentionally invested in their demise, when in reality we all engage in refuting and rebutting the realities of other people, because we experience memory in an event in a very different way. We experience ourselves, our self-concept in a different way, and so chances are the other person isn't a psychopath. You know, the percent is quite low in the general population. They're just a person trying to get you to believe them and help you understand where they're coming from.
I have 2 thoughts. One of them is, you know, we probably don't want to completely discount the experience of gaslighting, because it is real in certain cases and certainly has pretty profound implications for people. And I think I want to be able to sort of dive into that a little bit more with you all. This is not my area of expertise, so I'm going to rely on the two of you. But the other thing is, and this is sort of kind of a pet peeve of mine, is what do you guys think about the use of terms being pulled from film to serve as psychological constructs, right? Because I think this particular term, right, Joey?
Yeah.
Came out of film, did it not?
Yes, I believe it did. Yeah.
I don't know. I have maybe it's just a pet peeve of mine. We can ignore it. That's fine.
No, I mean, I think it kind of just goes back to, you know, there's a lot of popular level constructions of a lot of the psychological terms that psychologists use, you know, right. And you see this. I'm not a you know, clinician or a counseling psychologist, although, you know, Abby is a counseling psychologist, so I'd love to hear Abby's thoughts on this. But I know that there's just a lot of terms, specifically in like psychopathology, that are completely used, wrongly, right, or incorrectly by just the general public, right, people outside of psychology. And I think it creates, what it does is I think it creates just a lot of confusion, right? I mean, even things like narcissism, we can do a whole episode on narcissism. There's like a popular level construction of the term narcissism, but there's actually also like narcissistic personality disorder, but oftentimes those terms are used interchangeably when they're actually quite different things, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The term narcissism, right, comes from narcissus. So like we typically pull some of our terminology from popular life. And so I would say it has this circular experience where we derive these terminologies from things that pre-exist, and then we create psychological constructs with clear definitions, and then they become repopularized from one mechanism or another, and then it becomes a colloquial term that has different meaning. And when it has different meaning, or it has maybe a more expansive, broader meaning, it may include what we consider it in the psychological sense, but it's also including things that don't quite fit the psychological sense. And so when someone says, I feel gaslit, do they mean I feel like you are making me question my reality intentionally, and not just in this instance, but regularly? Or are you saying, I feel like you're not helping me feel grounded in my own reality right now? Because those may be two different things. So I absolutely struggle with that as a clinician, because when individuals come to me and they say, I think someone is X, or I think I'm experiencing X, we have to unpack it a bit more, and there might be more psychoeducation that happens. And even when teaching my students and I'll say a term, I don't know if we're on the same page, and we kind of have to really operationalize these constructs. And this is also why like science is so important, right?
Yes, exactly.
Because at the end of the day, how are we operationalize what we're talking about? And I think in psychology, especially because these are terms that are popular, people are invested in the human condition, people learn these terms one way or another. When I say the word values, what do I mean versus what does the person understand colloquially? So we need to slow down sometimes and just define the construct, so that we both are on the same page moving forward.
Thanks for bringing it back to science. As scientists, we have to have well-defined constructs, operationalized in a way that we can measure them, and so that the three of us and everybody else can agree on what it is that we're trying to measure, and agree that when we see something like gaslighting, it is indeed gaslighting as opposed to something else. So maybe we can talk a little bit about some of the negative consequences of real gaslighting. So what's the impact of gaslighting in, say, relationships, or on individuals who are authentically experiencing, I think you used the term, Abby, consistent or repeated instances of questioning one's reality?
Besides like self-doubt, distrust, difficulty trusting one's discernment, part of it may be having the individual doubt their reality in an effort to defer to the individual who is engaging in the gaslighting, right? And so there can also be this increased level of control lost by the individual. It can lead to mood effects like depression and anxiety. And it can also, at the end of the day, lead to greater dependency on individuals who may be posing harm to the individual. And it takes time after experiencing genuine gaslighting to reclaim some trust in oneself and trust one's emotions, one's memories, etc. And so it's no fun. It's not necessarily just a momentary experience of, I feel like you're making me doubt myself. It's multiple experiences where the individual is being made to feel like what they think has happened hasn't happened, or what they think they see isn't being seen, or a whole bunch of elements to it. So yeah, it can have some serious effects on an individual.
Just one paper that I cracked open this morning out of I think it was the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology or something. I can't remember what journal. Anyway, published in 2024. This particular paper was developing a new measure of gaslighting. But one of the things that I found really interesting is what that measure ended up correlating with. So, like you talked about depressive symptoms. Here are some of the other things that they identified as correlates of their measure of gaslighting. Number one, which was very strongly and not surprisingly related, is psychological abuse. So, gaslighting is a form of psychological abuse. Yes. So this is exactly what you'd expect. Also, a modest, I want to call it. This is a correlation of 0.25. So, put in context, reasonable. This was a big sample, by the way, so these are sort of quote unquote highly significant. So a correlation of 0.25 with physical assault, a correlation of 0.21 with economic control. I mean, these are things that you would expect to come along with gaslighting in a systemic case of it. There are a couple in here that I thought were kind of interesting, which I'll get to. Depressive symptoms, you mentioned depression, 0.41. Relationship quality, negative 0.57, right? And here's the one that really surprised me in some ways, is the correlation between relationship duration and gaslighting exposure as measured with this instrument was only 0.1. It was statistically significant, but a correlation of 0.1 is basically non-existent,
right?
Right. So it seems that there would be no evidence that people who are experiencing this are exiting their relationships. I assume that this is part of the control aspect of it. I don't know if you have more to say about that.
I mean, we at least know with abuse literature that it is usually difficult for individuals to leave relationships due to things like economic control, the psychological abuse, that it takes about 7 times for individuals to leave. And so it isn't surprising that it doesn't have an impact on people exiting the relationship, despite the quality of the relationship being less than ideal, if that's a nice way of putting it. I think
this was very insightful, and I'm glad we got to take a little bit of a deeper dive into some of the more specifics in relation to gaslighting, and kind of, again, parsing out that difference, right, between gaslighting and false memory representation. So it was great to hear all of your thoughts, Abby.
Thank you guys for part 2.
Yeah, no, this was, I think, the most impactful part. But how about we put some links into some articles and some resources for people in both of these episodes?
Oh, that sounds great.
Definitely.
All right. Cool. We'll talk to you later, guys.
Yep. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.